speakers today. Very thrilled to have you both here. If you could come on up. We have Karen Smith, who is a child clinical psychologist and board member of Athens Film Arts Institute. Thank you, Karen. And then we have Philip Holmes, who's chair of Neuroscience Program at UGA. So thank you so very, very much for being here. We won't have questions after the film. Basically what you'll be doing is hearing this talk, the science talk, and then if you have questions about specifically what the talk is about, then we can talk about that, see the movie, and then, I hope you'll have a really great time. So I'll leave it to you to tell them the topic of the title of the film, of the discussion, because I think that'll be a good way to introduce what you're talking about, if you don't mind.
Okay, so first of all, thanks Pam for inviting us.
Thank you.
For the Science on Screen. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah.
So thanks for coming out. So I'm going to be taking a couple minutes just to talk about what's happening in your brain when we experience fear and when we respond to some sort of threat in our environment or some sort of stressor in our environment, okay? So suppose you're working in the garden and you hear a rustling of leaves nearby and you see some plants moving, okay? Those stimuli, the rustling and the plants moving, will activate a structure I'm sure you've all heard about called the amygdala. And the amygdala is a really important part of our fear circuitry. So the amygdala is processing that information and telling other parts of the brain to pay attention to what's happening. And it's also telling another part of the brain that we might need to engage in some sort of threat response. That could be the fight or flight response or other behaviors. The first behavior that will be activated is a freezing response, because we're not too sure exactly what we're looking at or hearing or what's out there in the environment, okay? So, so it's telling a part of the brain just to freeze. If that rustling gets closer or it seems more apparent, then that's when we might startle or move away. So the amygdala is doing all that. It's processing the information. It's sending information to a different part of the brain called the locus ceruleus. And the locus ceruleus is communicating with our neocortex, and that's where consciousness is being processed. Our conscious activity depends on the neocortex. And the locus ceruleus is saying, okay, pay attention. There's something bad out there. We may have to do something. So the neocortex is also getting this information. But it's important to keep in mind that the amygdala has been activated before you're even aware of what's going on. So the amygdala is acting below the level of consciousness, okay? So that's an important thing to consider. So eventually we'll experience fear. Now we're paying attention to what's going on, and we notice that that thing that's rustling is a snake. So the amygdala picks up on the shape of a snake, it's wriggling, and it turns up its activity. It's telling the cortex, danger, danger. The locus ceruleus is saying, okay, cortex, pay attention. It's also saying to the hippocampus, another part of the brain that you've all heard about, saying, remember this. We have a snake in our garden, and in this part of the garden, there might be this threat, okay? So we remember the snake, and we're aware of it. The amygdala has activated all of this before we're aware of it, but we're now aware of it because the cortex is involved. Oh, and by the way, the cortex has had time to process the snake, and the cortex feeds back to the amygdala and tells the amygdala, oh, that's a copperhead. So turn up your activity to about a 7, right? It may have been a 3 or 4, but now we got to get it up to about a 7. And so at that point, that's when you might run away from the snake. So, so that's going to be the basis for why we're afraid of the snake at that time. So we've got a fear response working, and also we're going to remember that. So that means the following day, when we go out in our driveway and look at that part of the garden, we're going to remember that threat that was in that part of the garden, because that memory has been laid down, okay? Now, importantly, over time, as we walk through the garden, other parts of the garden, the cortex is processing the information and saying, hey, no snake. So maybe it's not such a problem. So if everything is working properly, the cortex will, our aware part of the brain, the cortex will say, we got this, it's okay. So there's a very important connection from the cortex, a particular structure called the prefrontal cortex that projects to the amygdala. And it basically gives that safety signal. It says, it's okay, we got this. We might want to be kind of careful, but everything is fine. And so that connection actually diminishes the amygdala and turns it down. Without that connection, the amygdala is just going to keep cranking. So it needs that connection from the cortex, from our awareness, to turn it down. Okay, so that's an active process. If the amygdala is continually activated, it actually sort of kindles itself. And it strengthens all of those connections to the locus coeruleus and other parts of the brain back up to cortex. And so that just gets stronger over time. So that's why our awareness of the situation is really important. Now, if that threat or stressor is really severe, then things can really go wrong with that circuitry that I just laid out. So with that, I'll pass it on to my colleague, Dr. Smith, and she can talk about those more significant kinds of things.
Okay, thanks, Phil. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. I've just decided that every therapist should have Dr. Holmes in the room with them to explain what's going on up there in the brain. But so, not to reveal any spoilers about what you're about to see, let's talk hypothetically about a young mother who might be in a gardening with her young newborn beside her. Hears the rustling in the grass, looks up, sees a snake, calls for help from her husband, who comes running. I'm actually describing my personal horror movie that plays in my head. He steps in a nest of snakes. He gets bit, she gets bit, mayhem ensues. She survives, he does not. Okay, that's a trauma. Would we agree?
Yes.
It's like, okay. So let's fast forward ahead several years. If this young woman has engaged in a pattern of avoidance, and what I mean by that is she has not allowed herself to think about the trauma, talk about the trauma, experience the feelings related to the trauma. She's shut it off because she has a child to raise, because she has a job to keep, because she has to keep going. What could happen is that she could be in a bunch of trouble several years down the line. If she were to visit a psychiatrist, she may be given the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. She could be experiencing an anxiety disorder. She could be significantly depressed if, in fact, kind of a normal, natural recovery process has been disrupted by patterns of avoidance. So, Phil, could you talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, so her amygdala is, first of all, it's been turned up to 11, right? And it's still cranking. Because there was never that signal from the cortex, the awareness, the facing the trauma, there was never that opportunity for that connection from prefrontal cortex to amygdala to work and shut the amygdala down. So that cannot happen unless you can actually process that trauma.
Okay, and just to say, in our culture, we don't really know what to do with trauma. We don't encourage people to talk about it so much. We don't really know how to help them process it. So what that lived experience could feel like is, made a few notes so I wouldn't say too much. This person might be emotionally unavailable, socially isolated, overwhelmed by the daily tasks of living, irritable, even aggressive at times. She might be having difficulty sleeping, having intrusive nightmares, generalized anxiety, this sense of dread, which you might say more about in a minute. She might find herself avoiding the places, the people, the events that were associated with the traumatic event. She might not have access to positive emotions, even positive emotions associated with her husband, who she's lost. So she might feel disconnected from herself, unable to move forward, just kind of dialing it in, putting one foot in front of the other, trying to get through each day. She's stuck, and post-traumatic stress disorder has been described as being stuck in a disrupted recovery process. By the way, children who are being raised by primary caretakers who are having these kinds of difficulties, we know are at much greater risk of developing their own emotional and behavioral problems. So, do you want to say anything about any of that at this point?
I just want to emphasize what Karen said about the feeling of dread, right? And that's a reflection of your amygdala being hyperactive. And so you would experience certainly intense fear, bouts of fear, but also the dread and really just impending doom, right? Impending danger. So that's the dread and the horror, because that's the job of the amygdala, is to say there's this threat out there. And unless you can retune the amygdala, that threat is always going to be there. And so that information, even though it's operating below the level of consciousness, that information will percolate up to the extent that we'll just feel this amorphous dread or horror. And so unless we can retune those circuits, that's going to persist.
Okay, and so another way of saying that is that what we know from the trauma and trauma recovery literature is that all wounds do not heal with time if we do not attend to them. On their own, these things don't get better. And so what happens is these memories, these thoughts, these feelings, they lurk. They interfere, they disrupt, they make mischief. They take us down. It feels as if they're going to consume us. And so what has to be done from a therapeutic point of view is the very thing that our young mom is trying not to do, which is she has to allow herself to feel the feelings, remember the memories, think the thoughts, process the trauma, actively process it. So the very thing that she's trying to avoid doing is the very thing that will help her move forward and through it. We have to learn how to face the trauma, the memories, the feelings, the thoughts, as a way of getting access to the possibility of sort of new life, I guess is what I want to say. So through a process called exposure, therapeutically, people can learn to tolerate and even over time reduce the intensity of the emotions that are associated with that traumatic experience. What's making that possible up there in the brain?
So that's really just literally strengthening that connection from prefrontal cortex to amygdala. It actually gets stronger as we unlearn the trauma. And that's a phenomenon referred to as neuroplasticity. So there's actually more connections, more axons, more of the stronger synapses, more synapses. And so that's the process of really learning to cope with that trauma.
And finally, I think it's important to say that we never really fully resolve trauma or loss or grief, not entirely. It stays with us, as any of you probably are well aware. So what we're hoping for is making a space in your life for this past event, making a space in your life for the grief associated with that event, so that you are now available to fully experience the present moment. And I just have to say, as clinical psychologist watching Babadook, which is not a movie I would probably typically choose to watch. I very much enjoyed a lot of connections between what Phil and I have been talking about and this movie, and I hope that you will see some of what we're talking about and what we see when we look at this movie, because I think the message of the movie is very sound. And having said that, I'll put in a little plug for therapy. If you know anyone, or you yourself are experiencing the debilitating effects of trauma, loss, grief, I do encourage you to encourage them to seek out therapy. It can be very helpful, and it works on the body level, it works on the mind level, it works on the heart level, it works on the brain level. So, questions, comments?
I think if the audience has questions, please go ahead. Andrew.
First of all, if anyone's wondering, I spent like a year and a half in grief counseling, and the stuff that we talked about is exactly the stuff that you said. And I'm like super happy because I only talked to one person. I'm like, I hope she's right. But that's exactly what they said. But my question is, and my mom and I don't agree on this, why is it good for you to watch horror movies?
That's yours.
Is it?
Is it mine?
Well, you're gonna, you can habituate to traumatic things. So if you're a herpetologist, you're not afraid of snakes because you're around snakes all the time. So you can habituate to things that are normally scary. So scary images, a lot of this is hardwired, right? So you may have never seen a snake before or a scorpion, but you will probably respond to it. It'd be very rare if you don't respond to it. That's hardwired. But you can certainly habituate to it, right? And that's true of most of these stimuli.
And I guess too, just sort of the vicarious exposure to the process of confronting fear and trauma. It's almost like the catharsis of, great tragedy. So yeah, I think it has something to do with that. Although thank you for that question. I'll go away from here thinking about it.
My question is, I don't know how, I'm not like the main kind of cognitive science, neuroscience focus of it, but contradiction is rooted in consciousness, I think. Like that's how language works, and that's how we kind of make symbolic meanings. And I love the Babadook, and like I've seen, this is gonna be like the 4th or 5th time that I've seen it, and I'm happy to see it in the theaters. But what's even so good about the narrative of it is the way that the trauma is tied to our lead's both biggest love and the most kind of horrific event that you could ever have happen to like a family unit. And just in traumatic events, the difficult thing is how do you, especially in like Western cultures, work through like accepting contradiction like that, even if it's like as kind of heightened as it is in this film. I don't know, that's kind of like the role of like talking through whatever traumatic thing happened. But
Do you want to repeat the question? I don't know if everybody heard it.
I don't think it's really a good. The question is the connection between trauma, consciousness, and contradiction. And in this particular example that you're going to see in the movie, the intersection of the thing that she loves the most and the most horrific thing that she can experience, and how do you process that? I think interesting in the movie, it's not too much of a spoiler to say that we do see that process. We do see how confronting the trauma makes it available for her to once again perhaps have the option of experiencing the positive emotions that were there before the trauma, which were really locked away by the trauma when she was trying to avoid it.
Right.
Sorry, trying not to give spoilers.
Yeah.
Any other questions at all? Thank you.
I actually haven't seen this movie. I avoided seeing it because I have kind of a traumatic upbringing from my mother. So I heard that this movie wasn't necessarily the most fun thing to see, but I wanted to come at it from this angle of having people talking about that. And so I read an article one time that said that children raised in unstable environments with possibly like emotionally abusive or unstable parents have too many pathways in their brain, to where like picking up on somebody's emotional state being one of agitation or you know, again, in the unstable, will cause you to go into your like fight or flight. And I was curious, you were talking about how the way to sort of heal those pathways being sort of wired incorrectly is exposure. So would you just be exposing yourself to like people's emotions and knowing that it wasn't going to so the way it works, I guess, when you're a kid is that like mom is upset and that means that I might not have anybody giving me dinner tonight. So it does correlate to a physical danger.
Right.
But then you grow up and you're an adult and it's like my boss is upset over something that maybe has nothing to do with me. That actually doesn't make my life incredibly dangerous anymore. And is it just I don't know exactly what my question is, but just what would your exposure be for that?
So you're right in pointing out that there's plasticity in those amygdaloid networks too. Those, you know, you do have a heightened fight or flight response. And in fact, people with PTSD, their locus coeruleus seems to be hyperactive. So they have heightened startle responses. So that's true. That all that wiring is actually stronger. The good news is stress buffering can be rather generic. It doesn't have to be all that specific. So in the exposure therapy that Dr. Smith talked about, that's really about sort of unlearning those cues that are associated that predict the threat. But they're also just general buffers that will activate that same pathway I was talking about from prefrontal cortex to amygdala that serves as a generic safety signal, things are okay, right? So if we're experiencing stress or anxiety, it could just be you know, a loving family member, or even in something traumatic like a car accident, a first responder who's very warm and calm can help calm you down. So even that, even if you don't know the person, that can be helpful in buffering the stress.
You raise a good point too, that as an adult, a person is able to use their thought process to say, that trauma that I'm remembering is in the past. That trauma is not happening to me now. I can notice my thought, I can notice my feelings, but I can also recognize that I'm safe. I'm safe in this moment. So you're right about that.
I've gone to a lot of therapy.
Well, I think if that's all the questions, if you wouldn't mind giving a really thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. So enjoy the movie. Thank you for coming out. We really appreciate it.